Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Every 2 weeks, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Today's guest is Ryan Howse, author of Red in Tooth and Claw, The Steel Discord, and The Alchemy Dirge, and reviewer at Grimdark Magazine and Before We Go blog. He's here with us to discuss the similarities and differences between fantasy writing for tabletop role-playing games and fantasy writing for a novel. But before we dive in, tell us a little bit about what we're drinking here in the pub today.
Well, I chose just some nice, delicious espresso. I go through several cups most days. My wife has one of her best gifts she ever gave me was an espresso maker and a grinder, both Breville, and it's just fantastic to get that sharp burst of energy when you need it.
Well, okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
All right, so I'm a husband and father of two from Regina, Canada. That's the big, boring part in the middle. I love it, but there's not a lot going on. I've got 3 different books out, as he mentioned. The Steel Discord was my first. It's a Magitech train heist following a wizard who's trying to rescue his mentor from a train after his mentor was convicted of conspiracy to commit regicide. There's the Alchemy Dirge, which is it's in the same setting, but with different characters. It's a drug-addicted alchemist and a black market arcana merchant who realized that the alchemist has accidentally unleashed one of the worst weapons known to man. And my newest book is Red in Tooth and Claw. It was intended to be a sort of palate cleanser between the other 2 books, which were very plot-heavy, very magic-heavy. This one just has 2 people trapped in the wilderness. There may or may not be magic. One person believes in it, the other doesn't, and nothing is ever conclusively proven one way or the other. It's a little bit more horror as well. And a big part of that one was basically just taking 2 unreliable narrators, have them look at the exact same thing, and just shove them off in with the exact opposite belief systems while experiencing the exact same thing.
Nice. Are you doing that as kind of a dual first-person POV setup, or are you doing third?
Very close, very tight third-person POV
Nice.
With alternating chapters between them.
Cool. Nice. Those all sound amazing. Actually, I'm gonna get those on my TBR. Okay, so for our topic today, which came first, novel writing or writing for TTRPGs?
Okay, so I didn't actually have any experience with tabletop role-playing games until I was in university, by which point I'd already written several terrible junior high and high school novels.
Nice.
I played sort of games that were sort of along the same lines, things like Hero Quest, Dragon Strike, which, by the way, if you've never found the YouTube video, it's hilariously awful. Things like that, but I'd never actually played Dungeons & Dragons or any other game like that until I was at university. Whereas novels, I think my first one I probably would have written in grade 8 or so. It was a Forgotten Realms pastiche. And I wrote, I want to say 6 or 7 between grade 8 and grade 12. Something like that, maybe more.
Oh, wow.
But like I say, they were all terrible.
Hey, I mean, you gotta. Everyone has to start. I would be shocked and amazed if your middle school novels were stellar achievements. But that's a big body of work. It's a lot of just a lot of words on the page. You know, it's a lot of practice to have down.
Yep, absolutely. I feel like when I was younger, I didn't have quite the like my prose and everything was awful, but I had a lot of enthusiasm, right? So it was a lot easier to get words down, even if they weren't good words.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that ability to just get it on the page is so valuable. I tend to be frozen a lot of the time when I'm writing, so I'm always jealous of people who can just get it out.
Did you read there was a, I think, New York Times or New York Post interview with John Swartzwelder from The Simpsons?
Oh, I saw that it just came out. I haven't read it yet, but
Well, he said that, yeah, he just writes the first draft just as terrible as possible on purpose, and then he can go back in afterwards and actually add in all the jokes and everything. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
So then you started playing TTRPGs in college. When did you start writing for them?
It wouldn't have been with my first group, but my second group of players that I started actually running games. And just like novel writing, the first ones were not that great. I think I would say, it's all about practice in a lot of ways. A big problem, and this is going to come down to, I think, a big structure of this episode, is like there are huge, huge differences between novels and campaigns, and a big part of that is the structure of a novel just does not lend itself to the same structure as a campaign very well. Now, the Wizards of the Coast website used to have this weekly essay called The DM Experience by Chris Perkins, who he runs games for the people who make D&D, and I think in some cases Pathfinder as well. And one of the big things he was saying was that you should structure it more like a TV series. So you've got so many episodes per season, which is like an arc in your campaign. You can have spotlight episodes where you're like, okay, this week we're going to look at the wizard. What's his deal? How does he relate to this? And you can do more things that, like in one session, it feels better if you do things that can stand alone a little bit better, even if they contribute to a larger arc. Whereas that doesn't quite work with chapters. My first campaigns were really, really bad because I was trying to write them like a novel, which means you start with a lot of the low, foreboding stuff. And that's not really that exciting to the players. The DM knows what's going to happen down the line with it. The players are like, I just want to hit an orc, man.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of find a way to balance it out so you're getting those little mini climaxes every session. And you can also do a lot of very different things with it, right? My current campaign, I've made up my own system, and I'll get into that later, but I started off with a time loop. It's a sci-fi game, so I started off with a time loop. And we've done full-on body horror. We've done things like The Thing. We've done a session like Alien. We've done sessions that are ridiculous holodeck things. And that would not work very well in a novel because they're such very separate, disparate concepts. But in a campaign or even in a TV show, they can work.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I like that idea of the TV show. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. It also seems like it would be good for not only pacing of the story, but also just at some point the game's got to end. People got to go to bed. So having those natural breakpoints, I would imagine, is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was your gateway from just playing tabletop RPGs into DMing and writing?
Well, it was just that we had one DM who was the more consistent DM, but sometimes he wants to play. And I, was a writer, so I thought, well, I've got this novelish idea. Maybe I can switch it over, turn it into a campaign. It didn't go well, but you know what? He's stuck with me. We still game pretty consistently, so I've gotten a lot better in the intervening years. But it was just basically like, you're doing this with your friends, right? There doesn't need to be a big pile of pressure. You're just trying to have a good time with them. So it just came down to people me saying, hey, sure, I'll run it. That way you've got a chance to actually play for once. And then we kept doing it. And over the many, many years, I've gotten, I think, pretty good at it.
What are some of the specific roadblocks you came across?
Okay, so let's see. There's the trouble with recurring villains. If you have tried to, especially early on, run a game, especially at low levels, when the villains shouldn't have that many super amazing powers, unless they're just intended to completely destroy the heroes immediately, then you can't really have those guys who, let's say you've got a mercenary who's after the heroes manage to get a few lucky crits and take him down. Well, what's going to stop them from killing him? How is he going to become a recurring character? So I needed to figure out ways that they would need to keep NPCs alive so I could have them come back, try to prevent them from... and I also had to have reasons for the mercenary to not just straight out kill the PCs. So things like that were Very, very common ones. Making sure every player had their kind of moment in the sun. That's a very common thing that if you're not giving that, people are just not going to want to be playing. No one wants to sit there and be bored all the time. Yeah, so a lot of it just comes down to practice and thinking things through, having achievable goals. And this was a thing I didn't learn for a while, but it comes out of Burning Wheel, which is now my favorite system. It's called Fail Forward. So even if you fail a roll, it doesn't necessarily stop the gameplay. It just adds in an extra dimension. So the example I think in the Burning Wheel book is, you're trying to pick a lock, and if you fail, you still get in, but maybe a guard sees you and alerts everyone.
I see.
That's picking the lock, then you're just stuck outside the door, and the game isn't progressing.
That makes a lot of sense. Keep the momentum.
Exactly. So another big thing that really helped me learn how to run was playing and running a lot of different systems, because they all have very specific things that they're really good at. And if you can kind of take the best parts of each of them and, learn from them, you're going to do pretty well with it. One
other question, but before I move on, just real quick, you mentioned 3 things that I'm not sure everyone is going to understand. You said crits, NPCs, and PCs. Could you describe those a little bit more?
Fair enough. Crits are critical hits.
Okay.
So in D&D, that's usually a 20. There's other systems that have different numbers for it, but Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder are the most popular, and a 20 is a critical hit for them. That usually means that it's not only a guaranteed hit, but it's usually something like double damage.
Gotcha.
An NPC is a non-player character, so if I'm running as the DM or the storyteller or whatever the name happens to be, that's everyone else in the world who is not also sitting at the table with me. The PCs are the player characters. So let's say my friend Ian plays a barbarian. He would be a PC. If I've got the bad guy cleric, then I would be running an NPC cleric.
Gotcha. Okay. And so back to the question, how many systems are there? Like, how many popular systems are used? Is it just endless, or is there kind of like the top upper echelon of game systems?
Well, there's been a huge indie explosion recently, and I think a lot of that's, the ability to sell these things online through PDF has really, really helped with that. So there's a lot of there's nearly endless systems. There's your few big sellers, which are, Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, which, for those who don't know, was created by people who left the people making Dungeons & Dragons.
Oh, okay.
Between 3rd and 4th edition, and then they basically took 3rd edition D&D and kept running with it. There's World of Darkness, which is Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf and things like that. There's Call of Cthulhu. Traveler is probably the most famous of the sci-fi ones I can think of, except for, of course, Star Wars. There's Burning Wheel, which is my favorite. There's Numenera, which is sort of a sci-fi fantasy hybrid, where you're really, really far in the future and everything seems like magic, but really it's all this weird alien technology. And then there's a lot of really small ones that I just think are neat. Like, a lot of one-page RPGs are becoming quite popular. Honey Heist is a really well-known one, where you've got 2 stats, bear and criminal, and you're just trying to steal honey. And the game is a bear trying to steal honey.
Nice.
There's a Frasier RPG.
No, hold on. Hold on. There's a Frasier RPG. Okay. Oh, that is the best thing I've heard all day. That sounds amazing.
Lost Dragons and Scrambled Eggs. I don't think it's technically licensed. It uses the same roll and keep system that the 1st edition of 7th Sea used, which I love, and I love Frasier. So it's like, chocolate and peanut butter together at last.
Oh, it's so good. Speaking of food and such, let's get back to our drink real quick.
Oh, yeah.
So one thing I always like to talk about with our drinks is the smell and the tastes, because we all know in writing they're the 2 most ignored senses, to get onto the page. So when you're having an espresso, and this specific espresso in particular, what's coming across? What are you picking up?
It's earthy. It's got a fantastic texture, exquisite mouthfeel, as I like to say. There's hints of chocolate. It's bitter, and it's really, really good.
Yeah, I don't have an espresso machine at home, so I decided to do the AeroPress Good Enough version. I looked up a mock espresso recipe for the AeroPress. It actually is not bad. It has a lot of the kind of the bright sour notes of an espresso without. It doesn't have the mouthfeel. It's more of a French press type mouthfeel, but it still has that almost lemon peel type bite to it. So it worked out. I would say this was a win. I definitely not a perfect espresso, but it's definitely a good coffee. I would drink it again. What type of coffee are you using?
I believe mine is President's Choice.
Nice.
Yeah. Simple and easy.
Is that a President's Choice? I'm trying to think. Is that a specifically a Canadian brand, or is that?
It is. It's one of the lower end Canadian brands.
Nice. I love that. It's one thing with coffee that I love is there's so many options out there. You just kind of find what you like, nail it. Like we spent about 4 or 5 months basically buying everything in the grocery store and trying to dial in which one was actually the one we were going to settle on. And then I don't think we've changed in like 3 years.
I feel like this is going to maybe knock me down a peg here, but it's definitely a quantity over quality sort of thing. It works, and I've certainly had better espresso, but like the bags are quite large, they're quite cheap, and I don't need to go to a specialty store during a pandemic to go buy them.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I bought a bag of coffee maybe a year and a half ago, and I kind of got duped into it. I went to a specialty shop and the guy talked it up, and before I knew it, I was handing him my credit card, and I was like, what did I just do? It's so expensive. Why did I buy this coffee? And then I took it home and it was fine, but it was like the most disappointing. I wanted it to taste like if gold was coffee flavored. I wanted it to taste like that. And it didn't. It tasted like if cardboard was coffee flavored, and it was super disappointing.
That was too bad. I've never tried out the weasel poop coffee. That is yet to cross me.
Yeah,
I know tried it out.
What is that called?
It's good, but it didn't seem quite worth the cost or the weird factor.
It's something Luwak, I think, like Kopi Luwak or Sophie Luwak, or I can't remember exactly, but I know what you're talking about. That's quite the process.
It is.
The one I have is a brand called Hanauer. It's German, I believe. It might be Swiss, it might be from here in Switzerland, but I think it's German. But it's just their Colombian. It's pretty solid. I've been happy with this one. All right, so back to our discussion. What are some of the crossover skills that you've taken from novel writing to your TTRPG writing, and then also vice versa?
I think probably the biggest one is world building. If I'm writing a novel, then I've got a pretty clear idea, and I can control the characters and say, okay, he's going to go from this place to that place. If I'm running a campaign, I don't know where they're going to go. I can lay hints. I can even power struggle with them if I really need to. But if they decide, like, I'm going to go gambling, then I need to have an idea of how gambling works in this society. I need to have places for it. I need to have some neat ideas behind gambling. Like, is this... trying to think of some of the... There were some wonderful made-up games for the opening of Scott Lynch's Red Seas Under Red Skies for just entirely fictitious gambling games. Things like that. So I need to have an idea of how that works. And in a novel, it really helps, even if it doesn't show up on the page, if I know that, hey, there's a gambling den here, and that's going to influence things like this. Even if the character never goes there, if there's a few offhanded mentions of this place, it gives that city a sense of coherency and consistency. So that's probably the biggest thing between the two. Whether you're writing a fantasy or sci-fi or what have you novel, or running a campaign, you need to know where the players are and what things are going to be available when they're there.
And so when you're writing for a campaign, do you basically complete the story and then start it with the other people in your group, or is it something more organic that just kind of grows as you play?
I might have some ideas for major NPCs, both villainous and otherwise, and of course I've got to have the setting down pat, but a lot of it's going to be organic, a lot of it's going to be depending on what the players want to do. I don't really want to railroad them, which is a term in gaming for basically saying, like, the DM says this is going to happen and then this and then this, like you're on a railway and you can't get off the tracks.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's the idea there. The opposite of that is called sandbox gaming, which is where you say, okay, the world is your sandbox, go into whichever direction you want, and I've got things prepped there. I feel like the current campaign, the sci-fi one's working really well because I can make mini sandboxes with each of the planets that they're going to come to, without needing to do the full sandbox experience, and I can still have some level of railroading between the planets when I say, oh, you come across a derelict freighter, oh, you're in an asteroid belt, things like that.
Nice. That sounds a little bit familiar from a novel writing perspective, where you're kind of balancing the information drip with the plot pacing and how deep into a scene you go.
Yes.
In description for your readers.
That's another huge difference, of course, is with a TTRPG, I kind of give a vague outline, and then they're going to run with it, and they can ask me specifically, like, oh, is there, I don't know, a chandelier in this bar that I can, leap on? Whereas in the novel, I've got to write that in, and I'm probably going to describe it in a much more nice way than if I am just talking to my friends over Discord or what have you.
How much do the actions of your players affect how you end up writing the campaign?
I mean, quite a bit. So like I say at the beginning, I usually try to have some pre-planned NPCs who I think are going to have large roles. A lot of it I do try to leave up to the players and what their goals are going to be. For instance, the campaign I feel was my first fully successful one was actually in the same setting that the Alchemy Dirge was. So that was it was really good things where the world building would bounce back and forth between them, and I could take things from the novel and put them in the game and vice versa. I would usually run one session out of every 3 would be like my meta plot. This is going to be what they're going to be reacting to what my big bad guys are doing, or the big political environments, things like that. One would be them choosing their objective, and I'm just going to give them as much freedom as they can to do what they want to do. And then the third one would be a reaction to whatever they did while they were pursuing their objectives. So in that campaign, they were trying to take over a thieves guild of a bunch of very poor people who were, thieves because they had no money. They decided that they were going to take over this guild and run it themselves and run it for more moral ends. So they would get one session where they could try to do whatever they wanted to do with that. Then they would have one session where either that thieves guild would react against them, or other people that they had annoyed would act against them using these things. They got on the bad side of a paladin. They got on the bad side of the mafia. It was a lot of different things that could have happened. So that way, they get a sense of stake in the setting, and you get to, it really, really influenced the way that the game went. So I think that giving them reasonable objectives that they want to pursue is very, very important whenever you're running a game, because that way they get to feel like, hey, I really changed something here. I had no idea they were going to go take over the Thieves Guild. That was not my original outline, but it worked out very, very well.
Nice. I'm gonna take a step back real quick because you said something that I'm very interested in. Could you talk a little bit more about the process for you when you were essentially parallel writing the campaign and the novel? That's fascinating to me.
There were actually a lot of scenes I ended up cutting out of the novel because they would have only been interesting if you'd played the game. And the games and the novels had very little in common, except for their setting mostly. But a lot of it was things like I had... So the Alchemy Dirge, like I said before, it's about this black market arcana merchant. So it was dealing with a lot of the criminal underbelly, things like that. Things like... there was a money launderer in it. He also would have appeared in the game. Things like that. They could have gone to his shop to purchase magical items. Things like that. The place that the Thieves Guild was in the campaign was the same place that the alchemist, the drug-addicted alchemist, lived. Although I did break down the gang into a much more, I think, reasonable sort of... it wasn't quite the epic thing that it was in the campaign because it didn't match the flavor of the book.
Gotcha.
But taking that setting and just knowing that I've got all these different things that mesh together really, really helped, I think, get that setting coming across feeling very alive.
Did you ever use the game as kind of a testing ground for ideas for the novel?
I sort of did the opposite once.
Okay.
I ran a campaign. I'd already written the first draft of a book, and I decided that I was going to run a Burning Wheel game, specifically with the intention of fleshing out that setting so I could take things from the game and put them into the book, because there's lots of times when I just don't think of things. So one of my players, for instance, said, like, this was sort of an ancient Greek analog setting, and one of the players said, well, a lot of the cities back then would have one special animal that they would sort of, it would be in a lot of their imagery. So
Gotcha.
What's the thing there? And I'm like, I hadn't thought of that. Can you give me an idea? And I think he said, well, let's make it a snake. And I said, sweet, this city is now a snake city. This
Nice.
city is now a lion city. Things like holidays, or the fact that the priests of the death god don't eat pork. I hadn't planned that, but one of the players was playing a priest of the death god. He said, no, I just don't think we eat pork. And I said, okay, well, that's a new thing to me, and I will put that in the book.
Nice.
Because those small little cultural details, it really helps flesh out the world.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go back. Let's zoom out again. If someone was only accustomed to playing a TTRPG, how would they go about making that leap from player to DM?
Well, again, you're usually doing this with friends of yours, so you can probably just say, hey, I'd like to run a game. And that should be fine. The hints I would give, I would definitely say things like, look at who talk to your players, find out what they're interested in. You can say, like, I feel like running a sci-fi game. I feel like running a superhero game. And you can kind of give, like, your pitch of the idea of it. But when they come back with their characters, that's kind of telling you what they want to see in the game. If you've got, let's say you've got a giant Hulk dude as one of your players. He's a guy who's going to want to beat stuff up. You know that. If you've got the guy who can jump between shadows, you've got someone wants to be sneaky. So they're telling you through that, this is the stuff I want to see in the game. And I always ask, what's just sort of a thing you want to have happen at some point in this campaign? So in one of my old Pathfinder games, I had the paladin say, I want to do a quest into hell. I want us to go to hell. Sure, I can easily do that. And a lot of the times, they're going to get things that kind of tie in with their character. Paladin Hell, okay, you can see how that flows. My favorite was the guy playing a pirate who said he wanted to try to fit in at a fancy ball.
Nice.
I'm like, absolutely. I would make that happen.
Would you recommend that someone starting off write an extension of games they've already played, a new version of games they already played, or just let their creativity flow into something brand new and fresh?
I wouldn't go ahead and make your own game until you've tried several.
Mm-hmm.
But I would definitely say if you feel like, you know what, I'm tired of playing Dungeons and Dragons, I want to try something else. Absolutely feel free to go read Call of Cthulhu and pitch it to your players. If you feel like you don't quite understand how it works, there's going to be lots of online plays where you can see people actually going through and breaking it down how it works in the system. That's what I would recommend. If you're going to do it, just do what you're interested in. Actually, making a system is a lot of work, and there's probably systems that mostly do what you want them to do. If you look around, one thing I really do dislike is there's a very strong tendency of people to just take Dungeons and Dragons because it's what they know and try to hack it into a bunch of genres that it doesn't fit with.
I see.
There's a lot of so, for instance, a lot of people want to do more of a grimdark thing with Dungeons and Dragons, and it doesn't work because you've got very, very high-level magic in these worlds, and even if you cut off the high-level magic, the low-level magic is pretty powerful, and there's no real cost to it. It's just that, you can only do it so many times per day. So I would say, look, if you're trying to do something like that, you need to look for different systems that are going to flow out that a little bit more. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, and then what tips would you have for somebody who, like you, is starting out from a more of a fantasy novel or short story writing background and is wanting to jump in to DMing? Do you mentioned some of the struggles before, but what would be your guidance to kind of steer that ship through the rocks?
I would say, again, think of it like a TV series. Don't think of it like a novel. That way you've got lots of small mini arcs. I would say try to jump through and do some focused episodes on each of your players where they get a chance to shine, where they get things to tie in with their backstory and things like that. I also usually ask my players to give me, at least one hook with their backstory. One sort of, what's your personality going to be like? What are your goals? And by using those three things, I can kind of guide the game. So that would be my starting point. I would also say, if you've got all that experience with novel writing and things like that, again, you are doing it with your friends. It shouldn't be that intimidating. You're there to have a good time. Don't worry if you mess up. It's going to happen. Like I say, I think I'm pretty good now, but even I had a great third act twist, totally forgot it in the middle of the game. I had the heroes pinned into this little temple in the middle of nowhere. I had two priests of the god of knowledge. I was going to have the villains burn the library that was just outside their little antechamber where they were hiding. Totally forgot. So they got away with things a little easier than I was hoping for. But you know what? It's going to happen. That's how games work. They're going to be spur of the moment. You can't expect every single thing to happen the way you're hoping it's going to happen. You've got to be a little bit more open to organic plotting. You've got to realize that your players want to drive the story. That doesn't mean you can't have your general story going on as well. A very common piece of advice I hear is that if they're just going to ignore your plot, then that doesn't mean your plot's not going to happen. And that sort of depends on what you want to do with it. I have dropped plot lines because it was clear that none of my players were interested in them. But there's other plot lines when I'm like, no, this is a big thing, and I think it's going to happen, and I think it's going to be interesting. where you just say, okay, well, if you're not focusing on this big bad, he is, oh, look, he just took over, the north part of the city or what have you.
So would you say then that a pantser might have a little easier time jumping in with DMing as opposed to someone who's a real hardcore plotter?
I think so, yeah. I think because when you're plotting a novel, of course, you can choose every single thing your character is going to do. You can't do that when you've got other players who are like, well, no, that doesn't interest me. There was one time in a game I was playing in, my wife and I were both. We had a couple of our players were out, so my wife and I were the last ones there with the DM, and we just basically, the DM said, okay, this is going to be like the end of this little arc of the game. He didn't say that, but it was implied. And he had this villain who'd been lying to us all the time, saying, well, you need to go here to do this thing. And my wife and I just said, well, we don't trust you, and we walked away.
Nice.
And my DM was like, what? And he didn't know what to do. He ended up solving it later with different characters, and that's fine. But basically, he'd had one NPC we were supposed to try to rescue captured, but the person telling us this was someone neither of us trusted at all. So we just said, we don't believe you, and we walked away. You need to be able to roll with things like that.
So let's flip the previous question around. What advice would you have for somebody who already is a DM and writes campaigns, who is wanting to dip their toes into novel writing? What skills do they already have that they can bring into that new style?
As I said before, I think world building is a huge one there. If you're already, unless you're playing in a pre-existing world like the Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance or Star Wars, you're going to have some pretty good ideas of how your setting works, and that's really going to help. That said, character arcs in a campaign are very, very different from character arcs in a novel, because those characters are controlled by someone else. And you know what? Sometimes it's just going to be that player, when you think they're going to have this big arc moment in a TTRPG, maybe they're just really tired that day. Maybe they had an awful day. It's not up for it. In a novel, that's not going to happen. You need to make sure that you're building towards this arc, whatever arc that happens to be. You can do a lot more slow-paced things, and you also need to make sure a novel is not like a TV show, it's not like a TTRPG. Got to make sure you've got a consistent tone, and that's not to say that a serious book can't have its funny moments, but you can't have it's not quite as elastic.
Oh, that's a good word. I like that.
As a campaign could be.
That makes a lot of sense. That seems to be a recurring theme of what you're talking about, is just the massive amounts of flexibility required for the campaign writing. All right, let's pop back to our coffee again. And so one thing that always fascinates me about coffee is both how, speaking of flexibility, how extremely flexible people can be, and also how rigid and militant they can be. I tend to be in the camp of people where it's just get the coffee in me. Espresso, latte, iced coffee, I don't care. I'll drink it all. I love coffee. I just want the coffee in me. Are you are you the type of person who's like, I like my espressos? That's the form that I prefer it to take? Or are you also kind of the coffee garbage dump like I am?
I think I'm probably a coffee garbage dump.
Yeah.
I do espressos because I've got the maker right next to me. When I work from home now, but when I wasn't working from home, I took just like a thermos of coffee to work. I've got stuff to make things like lattes and chai and stuff like that. I usually just do the espresso because it's fast and easy.
Yeah.
And it tastes good. If I've got company over, I'll usually just make a pot of coffee. I'm good with all of it. I just need my caffeine.
Yeah, yeah. Are you an all-day coffee guy, or are you just morning?
Usually I drink quite a bit in the morning. I drink a couple late afternoon, and that'll keep me going. If I have it after supper time, it's gonna mess with my sleep. But otherwise, and I'm sorry because I guess it's much later for you than it is for me during.
That's fine. No, I come from my mom will drink coffee at 1 a.m. and then just go to bed. Like she's a champ with that. I come from good stock when it comes to late night coffee drinking.
I used to be like that. It's aging has wrecked that from me, but so it goes.
Okay, Ryan. So I have another question for you. What would you like to see more of in TTRPG writing?
No, that's a really hard question to answer because there's a lot out there right now. Like I said, we've had this massive indie boom recently. I guess the reason I went and just made my own system is because the one thing I couldn't quite find was I wanted a system where I could make it so people could build their characters out in any way they wanted, using experience points as building blocks rather than a leveling system. So I wanted to be able to, like, if you're doing D&D, for instance, there's a set list of skills, and it's the same with most other games. Numenera, for instance, has a suggested list, and then you can also, if you want to make something up, you can. But I wanted to say, you know what? You guys can make whatever you want. If you want to have, let's see. If you want to make your tactician, which is like my soldier class, able to juggle, feel free. Why not? You can be a juggler. That's no problem. I wanted to make it so each class kind of has their specialties when they're on the ship, because a lot of times if you're like watching a Star Trek episode, you'll have the guy you'll have someone at the comms, you'll have someone at tactical, you'll have someone doing this and that, and they'll all have their own roles. So I wanted to make it so each class had their role to do, but beyond that, your classes were pretty interchangeable. I think I gave engineers had the ability, in addition to everything else, to like make little drones that could fly around and see things, and scientists make charges like little bombs. But other than that, the classes are pretty interchangeable. It's really the skills that you've got when you're on the ship. So that's why I sort of built my own, was to make a much more flexible system that still did the things I wanted it to do. Other than that, though, like, there are so many games out there that it's impossible to say that I'm missing, that these games aren't out there. They're just hidden. You need to know how to look for them. The Reddit RPG forum is often really full of a lot of good, interesting things like that. Sure, you do get a lot of the popular ones coming up again and again, but if you say, like, oh, I want a game where you travel a dream realm, they're going to have something very specifically set aside for that. And the people who are fans of that are going to say, you need to play this, and this is why. And I'm sure there's lots of other things. There's the Gauntlet is a huge RPG forum that will have lots of people looking into indie things. So I don't think I can say there's anything that is missing. There's so much out there all the time. It's just that there's so much, it's hard to find what you're looking for.
Okay, so then let's flip it around. Is there anything that you've noticed that has kind of started to become overdone? Something you'd like to see a little less of in the TTRPG world?
Well, okay. I don't want to tell people how to have fun or not. I do think
that's fair.
That hacking D&D into genres it's not meant to do doesn't work. There are other systems that are better for that. So I don't like... there was a huge surge in, I think, the 90s and maybe early 2000s of all these D20-based modern, sci-fi, cyberpunk, all that stuff, because at the time Wizards of the Coast had opened up their licensing to anyone who wanted to.
Oh, interesting.
And made huge gains by doing so. But again, the D&D system doesn't necessarily emulate every kind of fiction you want to do. So I would rather find the specific game that does the thing you're trying to do. Other than that, things I don't like seeing... I mean, I'm not personally a fan of some of the more narrativist games that are becoming popular, like Fate, which is just, I find it's too simplistic. I like some mechanical depth to the game. I don't like it to be quite as random as some of those games make things out to be. That said, again, if you're enjoying those games, then more power to you. It didn't work for me, but I'm glad if it's working for you. So there's nothing other than hacking D&D into every possible presentation that I really don't like seeing.
Nice. Okay, we're going to pop back to our coffee one last time real quick. One question I like to ask my guests is, where do you think is the right setting? We've talked a lot about world building today. What's the right setting for having an espresso? We've all been stuck in our houses for a real long time. If you could go out right now, pop down in a chair somewhere, what would that setting be?
For an espresso, I feel like if I had one of those, now I live in a city, so I don't have this. I've just got a regular backyard. But if I had one of those backyards that opens out onto like full-on forest and stuff like you'll see in the Pacific Northwest and things like that, going out there early in the morning, steam's rising off your espresso cup, sit down just in your own backyard. It's slightly chill and the espresso is like the right warmth to keep you content. I think that would be about perfect.
All right, Ryan, it's last call here in the Indie Pub. Can you give an indie published book or TTRPG or both or a few of them that you would want more people to check out?
Okay, so one of the, as I said, I've made my own sci-fi RPG, but my very best session, I bought a module for Mothership, which is a body horror sci-fi RPG. The only reason I didn't run my campaign in it is because you're going to die really fast. But I think Mothership is a fantastic system. It's super creepy, it's full of dread, and I think it's wonderful. That would be my first recommendation. Also, as I've said a few times through this podcast, I think Burning Wheel is about my favorite system. It seems very complex, and there are definitely complex subsystems in it, but the basis of it has made better fleshed out characters than I've ever seen in any other system. The merchant in the Alchemy Dirge is actually the merchant I played in a less steampunk version in Burning Wheel. In Burning Wheel, you get a bunch of different life paths that you choose. Those life paths give you different skills, and it kind of shows like, okay, you know what? He was, in his teens, he was a student. So he learned this and this as a student. Then he became, a helper in a thing, and he learned this and this from that. So you get your skills by determining what you were doing in your life up until the moment the game starts. And I think that's fantastic. And you get better at things by doing them in the game, whether or not you fail at them. So if you roll a success or you roll a failure, you're still going to improve your abilities. And that, I've found, makes players a lot more willing to try things that maybe they shouldn't try. Because even if they fail and the game goes bad, their character's getting better, and that's really the most important thing. Other systems, I have a lot of love for the very first edition of 7th Sea. I think it's not really available anymore except in PDF on DriveThruRPG. I haven't played the second system, or the second edition of it, but the first is so much fun swashbuckling. Very, very well set out. And you know what? I got to throw out one more. There's another one of those one-page RPGs. It's called Nice Marines. And it's basically a bunch of space marines after the war trying to go through this nice diplomatic thing, except the stats are set up in such a way that you're guaranteed not just to succeed, but to succeed too much and make an even bigger mess of things.
Nice.
Like, the goal is to get a 6, and your dice run from like a D4 all the way up to a D20 or 2 D12s. And if you go over 6, you're going to mess things up. And it would be great for a long campaign, but just a one night of just pure ridiculous carnage, it seems like it would be a lot of fun.
Oh, it does sound fun. That's a great premise.
Right? And that's the great thing about these one-page RPGs. They're good for those one nights when maybe not everyone can make it, and you're just going to go have some absolutely ridiculous chaos happen.
Okay, go for it. Sorry.
Well, I'm gonna pitch Jim's book here because I did read Radio quite a while ago, and it was fantastic.
Thank you.
If you think I'm just sucking up, I did a review for it for Grimdark Magazine.
Yes, thank you for that as well.
Not a problem. Feel free to go Google that right now, people, and then go buy his book. Raymond St. Elmo does some absolutely wonderful, almost Borgsian magical realism stuff. The Origin of Birds and the Footprints of Writing really, really blew me away last year. Just a very, very neat premise that starts out fairly normal and then just gets ridiculous and amazing and literary in the very best way. It's a book that just says, you know what you love? You love books, and you're going to keep loving books, and I'm going to hit you with books because you love books so much. It's fantastic. The Mold Farmer, which isn't indie, I guess. It's very small press. But it was probably my favorite book this year. It's a novella about laborers, day laborers, in the aftermath of an alien invasion. It's cosmic horror mixed with day laborers. It's great. The last one I will mention is Krystle, Matar's Legacy of the Brightwash. It's been getting a lot of rave reviews. I also reviewed that one for Grimdark Magazine. It's kind of gaslamp Victorian epic mystery with a really moral lead where the villain is systemic oppression. How do you fight that? It's not like one bad guy that you can just stab. And that's fantastic and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really like that one.
What was the title of that again?
Legacy of the Brightwash.
Oh, it's a great title, too. I like that. Okay, so same question, but for any other media, indie or not, what do you think people need to check out?
Man, I'm probably not the guy for other things. Yeah, I don't know. I watch too many 90s shows to be hip with the TV stuff. I don't have a lot there, to be honest.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so finally then, tell our listeners what you have going on and where they can find you and your work.
Okay, well, I'm on Twitter at twitter.com/Ryan Howse. That's RYANHOWSE. I review books for Grimdark Magazine, like I said, and for Before We Go blog. I've got those 3 novels out that you should buy all my books. The Steel Discord, the Magic Tech Train Heist. The Alchemy Dirge, which is its kind of sequel, sort of a noir fantasy crime book, and then Red and Tooth and Claw, which is a wilderness survival fantasy horror. As for what I'm working on now, it's a little too early to really be pitching too much stuff. I think it's pretty neat, but I'm not going to give away too much just this early. I feel like this one's going to require a lot of revising, but I think when it's done, it's going to be very good.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.